Paul came on a Tuesday morning while I was deadheading roses in the backyard. My sister-in-law's voice was bright in a way that immediately put me on edge. "We're coming for Thanksgiving this year," she said. "Gerald and I want to host it at your place. More room for everyone." I stood there with my pruning shears and said, "Of course, Diane, that sounds lovely." I hung up and stood very still for a moment, listening to the birds. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what yet. "My name is Constance. I'm 69 years old. I was a licensed social worker for 31 years, mostly child protective services, then elder care in the last decade before I retired. I know what manipulation looks like. I know what it sounds like. I know the particular way someone's voice changes when they want something they haven't told you about. Diane had that voice on the phone. My husband passed 4 years ago. Warren had a massive stroke in the driveway, came home after his Tuesday morning walk, and was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 67. We had been married 41 years. After he died, I stayed in the house. Our house, the one we bought in 1989 in Raleigh, North Carolina, a 4-bedroom colonial with a magnolia tree in the front yard that Warren planted himself the year our youngest was born. The house is paid off. Everything is paid off. Warren was an engineer and a careful man, and he left me comfortable. Not wealthy in a way anyone would write about, but comfortable. Enough. Gerald is Warren's younger brother. He's 63. He married Diane about 12 years ago. His second marriage, her third. They live 40 minutes away in a newer subdivision. Nice house. 2-car garage. Always slightly more house than they can actually afford, if I'm being honest, though I've never said that to anyone. We see each other at Christmas, Easter, the occasional birthday. It's cordial. It has always been cordial. Thanksgiving came. They arrived at 11 in the morning, Gerald, Diane, and Diane's daughter from her second marriage, a 26-year-old named Sasha, who I had met maybe 4 times total. Sasha brought her boyfriend, a quiet man named Travis, who barely spoke and spent most of the afternoon looking at his phone. My own children were there too. My daughter Patrice drove up from Charlotte with her husband and my 2 grandchildren. My son Kevin joined on video call. He lives in Seattle and couldn't get a flight. That was fine. We propped the tablet against the centerpiece and he watched us eat turkey. It was a good afternoon, genuinely good. The food was right. The grandchildren were loud in the best way. Gerald told a long story about a fishing trip that everyone pretended to find more interesting than it was. Diane kept refilling everyone's wine, including my glass, which I mostly just let sit. Around 3 o'clock, while Patrice was helping the kids with their plates, and Gerald had wandered into the living room, Diane sat down next to me at the kitchen table. Just the 2 of us for a moment. She put her hand over mine. "Constance," she said, "I want you to know we're here for you. Gerald and I both. Whatever you need." I looked at her. "That's very kind. This house is so big for one person." She squeezed my hand. "Have you thought about what comes next? I mean, practically speaking. Have you talked to anyone?" "I have an estate attorney," I said. "Everything is in order." She smiled, but her eyes didn't quite match it. Of course you do." That was all. She got up to check on the pie. I sat there for another moment. "Whatever you need. This house is so big." I kept smiling for the rest of the afternoon. That night, after everyone left, I washed the good china by hand, the way I always do, and I thought about that conversation. I turned it over carefully, the way I used to turn over case files. I'd spent 31 years learning to listen to what people don't say. What Diane didn't say was who she'd already talked to. What she didn't say was what they'd already decided. In the morning, I called my estate attorney, a woman named Frances who I'd worked with when Warren died. I told her about the conversation. I told her I might want to review the documents. She said to come in whenever I was ready. I was ready that Friday. Frances pulled up everything. The house, the retirement accounts, the small investment portfolio Warren had built over 30 years. She walked me through it again, slowly, the way she had 4 years ago, when I was still raw with grief and not entirely taking things in. This time I listened differently. "Has anyone asked you about any of this recently?" Frances asked, and I could tell it wasn't a casual question. "Why?" She set down her pen. "Constance, I've had 2 other clients in the past year, both widowed women, both in their late 60s, where family members began laying groundwork well before anything official happened. In both cases, the family member had already spoken to a different attorney to understand their options." I was quiet for a moment. What options, I said, would those be? She explained it carefully. Conservatorship, if a family member could establish through a sympathetic physician, through documented behavioral concerns, through financial irregularities, that an older adult lacked the capacity to manage their own affairs, they could petition the court to take legal control over finances, over living arrangements, over everything. It takes time, Frances said. They build a case slowly. Usually the person doesn't know it's happening until it's already quite far along. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time looking at the magnolia tree. Then I went inside and called Patrice. Patrice is 44 years old. She works in hospital administration. She is the most practical person I have ever raised, and I have always been grateful for that, especially now. I told her everything. The Thanksgiving conversation, the meeting with Frances, what Frances had explained about conservatorship. There was a long silence on the other end. Mom, she said, how long has this been going on? I don't know yet. What do you need from me? I told her. I needed her help checking something I wasn't entirely sure how to check on my own. I had noticed in the weeks since Thanksgiving that Gerald had dropped by the house twice unannounced. Both times he walked through the room slowly, asking about this or that, picking things up and setting them down. He said he was just in the neighborhood. He asked once whether I'd had any memory issues. He asked it casually, like it was nothing, in the middle of a sentence about something else. And I had started in the past week to notice a small irregularity in my home office. Nothing I could name exactly. Papers slightly out of order. A drawer that I was certain I had left closed, left open. Small things. The kind of small things that a person might dismiss as ordinary forgetting. I am 69. I am in good health. My mind is sharp. I have an IQ that served me well for 3 decades in a demanding profession, and I am not in the habit of leaving drawers open. Patrice came up that weekend. She brought her husband, Carl, who works in IT security. Carl spent 3 hours going through the house quietly and methodically. He checked out lips, smoke detectors, the cable box. He checked the landline. He checked the small digital clock on my nightstand that had been a gift from Gerald 2 Christmases ago. Carl found it inside the clock. It was small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, a recording device, not a camera, but sophisticated, voice-activated. It would have captured every phone call I made near that nightstand, every conversation in my bedroom. We found another one inside a smoke detector in the hallway. One that had been there when I moved in, but that I now looked at differently, and that Carl took down and opened and found had been modified. I sat at the kitchen table while Carl set both devices on the counter, and Patrice stood with her arms crossed, very still, the way she stands when she is trying not to cry. Okay, I said. Mom, I'm okay, I said. Mom, I said. I need to think. I have spent my career sitting across from people in crisis. I have helped families navigate the worst moments of their lives. I have testified in court, filed reports, made hard calls. I know how to be in a room with terrible information and not fall apart. I held on to that now like a handhold on a cliff face. I did not call Gerald. I did not change anything in the house. I left the devices where Carl had found them. He put them back carefully exactly as they were, and I began to build my own case. Frances connected me with a private investigator named Howard, a retired Raleigh police detective who specialized in elder financial abuse. Howard was 61 years old, compact, and very quiet in a way that reminded me of certain colleagues I trusted over the years. He listened to everything. He did not seem surprised. This pattern is more common than people know, he said. How much are we talking about asset-wise? The house alone is worth about $480,000 in the current market. Retirement accounts, another $340,000. Some other investments. He nodded slowly. That's enough to motivate people, he said, who maybe weren't motivated before. He started with the basics. He checked whether Gerald had consulted any attorneys in the Raleigh area in the past 12 months. He checked whether Diane had spoken to any physicians. He spoke to neighbors, carefully, without specifying why, about whether anyone had come by the house in my absence. It took 3 weeks. What he found was methodical. Gerald had met twice with an attorney who handled guardianship and conservatorship cases. Diane had contacted my own primary care physician's office, posing as a concerned family member, and had described to the nurse what she called worrying changes in my behavior, confusion, disorientation, forgetting bills, none of which had ever happened. The physician, my doctor of 11 years, had flagged the call in my file, but had not acted on it without further evaluation. She called me herself when Howard, through Francis, made a quiet inquiry. She was alarmed. She documented everything. Howard also found that Gerald had borrowed significantly against his own home in the past 18 months. Diane had lost her job in June. They were not, as it turned out, fine. They were quietly desperate in the way that decent-seeming people sometimes get when the water rises slowly and they haven't told anyone. I understood it. I did not forgive it, but I understood how you could get there, looking at someone else's paid-off house, someone else's retirement security, and starting to think about proximity and paperwork and time. I held one more thing Howard found until I was ready to use it. In mid-December, Gerald called and suggested we do Christmas at my house this year. Keep the tradition going, he said, the whole family together. He mentioned almost in passing that he'd been connecting with a few people who care about you, Connie, about making sure I had support as I got older. I told him Christmas at my house sounded wonderful. I told Francis. I told Howard. I told Patrice and Carl, and I called my son Kevin in Seattle and explained everything from the beginning. Kevin was silent for a very long time. Then he said, "Mom, tell me what you need me to do." "I need you to fly in," I said, "and I need you to bring a suit." Christmas Eve, the house was full. Gerald and Diane were there, Sasha and Travis, Patrice and Carl and the grandchildren. Kevin had flown in from Seattle and was helping the kids set up a board game in the living room. I had cooked my standing rib roast, twice baked potatoes, the green bean casserole Warren always asked for. The house smelled like it should. The fireplace was going. I had also, 3 days earlier, called Gerald's attorney. Not confrontationally, I had called as myself, identified myself clearly, and told the attorney's receptionist that I was Constance, Gerald's sister-in-law, and that I understood Gerald had been consulting with their office about guardianship matters, and that I would be speaking with my own legal representation imminently. I was polite. I left my callback number. Gerald's attorney had called Gerald. Gerald didn't know I knew he'd been called, but I had asked Howard to watch for it, and Howard had his ways. After dinner, after the plates were cleared and the children had retreated to the den with their new Christmas gifts, Gerald stood up to make a toast. He's always been the one who makes the toast. He likes the moment of everyone looking at him. He talked about family. He talked about Warren, which was genuine enough to make my throat tighten for just a moment. He talked about wanting to make sure I was taken care of. Then he said, "Diane and I have been thinking. Connie, we'd love to talk about you coming to live with us. Or, if you want to stay here, about us being more involved in helping you manage things, just to take some of the weight off." The room was very quiet. Kevin looked at me from across the table. Patrice had her hands in her lap. I set down my wine glass. "Gerald," I said, "that's such a thoughtful offer. I do want to talk about this actually. I've been hoping we could." I looked around the table. "But first, I have something I want to share with everyone." I had printed everything. The documentation of Gerald's consultations with the conservatorship attorney, the record of Diane's call to my physician's office and the false claims she'd made, the analysis from Carl showing where the recording devices had been placed and when, cross-referenced against Gerald's 2 unannounced visits. Howard's report. Francis's legal assessment of what would have happened had the plan progressed. I passed copies around the table quietly, the way you pass the rolls. Diane's face went very still. Gerald looked down at the papers and then up at me, and I saw the moment he understood that the conversation had already happened, that it had been happening for weeks, and that he was not at the beginning of something. He was at the end. "I was a social worker for 31 years, I said. "I spent the last 8 of those years specifically in elder protective services. I know this playbook, Gerald. I helped write the guidelines our county uses to identify it." Travis, Diane's daughter's boyfriend, very quietly got up and went to the kitchen. I don't blame him. He had nothing to do with any of it. "I've already spoken with the Raleigh Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit," I said. "Unauthorized surveillance devices were placed in my home. That is a felony in North Carolina. The deliberate misrepresentation to my physician for the purpose of building a fraudulent competency case is also actionable. Francis has advised me on both." Gerald started to speak. I held up my hand. "I am not going to the police tonight," I said. "It's Christmas Eve. What I am going to do is give you an opportunity that most people in my position don't have, to understand exactly how close you came and to choose what happens next." I had 3 things I needed from them. They were not negotiable. First, a signed and notarized acknowledgement of what they had done, prepared by Frances's office, that I would hold. Not for prosecution, unless something changed, but for my own protection. Second, all devices removed from my property by Carl that evening. Every single one. Third, Gerald was to call his conservatorship attorney in the first week of January and terminate the engagement in writing with a copy forwarded to Frances. I told them to think about it overnight. I told them the children didn't need to know what was happening. We could tell them Gerald felt ill and they'd stepped out. Children don't need to carry adult failures. They signed the acknowledgement on December 27th at Frances's office. Gerald looked 10 years older than he had at Thanksgiving. Diane didn't look at me. That is the part of the story that people always expect to feel like triumph. It didn't entirely. Gerald is Warren's brother. I stood in Frances's office and watched him sign his name and thought about Warren, about the two of them as boys in photographs I've kept for 40 years, fishing off a dock somewhere in South Carolina, identical sunburns, identical grins. I thought about how grief does strange things to people. I thought about how fear does stranger things. I don't know if I forgave them. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word. I released them, maybe. The way you release something that bit you. You open your hand and it goes, and you tend the wound. I had my own physician do a full cognitive assessment in January, completely clean. She noted in writing for my file that the earlier inquiry from a family member was documented and had been determined to be without merit. That document is in Frances's safe. I updated my estate documents. Everything goes to Patrice and Kevin equally, with a specific provision protecting the house until my death. I added a trusted contact provision on all my financial accounts, Patrice and my attorney, not any in-laws, so that any unusual account activity would trigger an automatic alert. I also changed the locks. Carl helped me install a proper home security system with cameras that I control, that stream to my phone, that no one else can access. And then I did one more thing. In February, I called a woman I had known professionally for years, a colleague from my elder care days named Shirley, who runs a volunteer advocacy program for seniors at risk. I told her what had happened to me, not the names, not the specifics, but the pattern, the recording devices, the physician contact, the conservatorship groundwork. Constance, she said, we see this more than you'd think, more than the public knows. I know, I said. That's why I'm calling. I now volunteer with Shirley's program 2 afternoons a week. I talk to older adults who are trying to understand their rights. I explain what conservatorship is and what it isn't. I explain what to do if something feels wrong, who to call, what documents to request. I tell them that instinct matters, that if your body goes quiet and still when someone says something too kind, too fast, that stillness is information. You don't have to be a social worker for 31 years to trust yourself. You just have to be willing to listen. Patrice was here last weekend with the grandchildren. We baked the same Christmas cookies I've been making since she was 6. My grandson got powdered sugar on the dog. My granddaughter, who is 8, asked me to teach her to knit. And we sat on the couch together with a skein of yellow yarn for most of the afternoon, and she was terrible at it in the excellent way that 8-year-olds are terrible at things, completely committed, not at all discouraged. Warren's magnolia tree bloomed early this year. I don't know if that means anything. I looked at it through the kitchen window while the kettle heated, and I thought about him. The way I do most mornings, quietly and without agenda. The house is the right size for me. I want you to know that. It has always been exactly the right size. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry, whether I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about that clock on my nightstand, the one Gerald gave me for Christmas 2 years before he put a recording device inside it. Whether I lie there in the dark and feel the particular kind of rage that comes from being betrayed by someone you shared 40 years of family dinners with. Honestly, not anymore. Not the way you'd expect. What I feel more than anything is clear. Clearer than I've been in years, maybe. And I've been thinking about why that is. I spent 31 years watching what happens when people make choices from fear instead of from conscience. Fear of not having enough. Fear of being left behind while someone else appears comfortable and secure. Gerald and Diane were afraid. That doesn't excuse what they did, not even close, but I understand the mechanism. I've seen it hundreds of times, in case files, in courtrooms, in kitchen tables not so different from mine. When people are desperate and won't admit it, even to themselves, they start rationalizing. They start telling themselves a story where what they're doing is actually reasonable. protective even. And the story gets more elaborate the further they go. Because it has to. It has to cover more ground. That's the part that people don't talk about with situations like mine. The planning it takes. Gerald didn't wake up one morning and decide to destroy his sister-in-law's life. It happened in increments, each one small enough to almost feel justified. That's how integrity erodes. Not all at once, but in quiet steps that each seem like they're barely steps at all. And here is what I know from being on the other side of it. Those steps leave marks. Not just on the person being wronged, on the person doing the wronging. Gerald signed that acknowledgement in Francis's office, and he looked diminished in a way I had never seen him look before. Not because he got caught, because of who he had become in the process of trying to get away with it. You cannot spend months building a false case against someone you once loved without it costing you something permanent. That's not punishment from the outside. That's just the weight of the person you decided to be. I think about Patrice, who drove up the same weekend I called her, no hesitation, no questions, before "What do you need?" I think about Carl methodically going through every room. I think about Kevin flying in from Seattle in a suit because I asked him to. The people who showed up did so because of years of small choices, the kind of choices that look like nothing at the time, being honest when it would have been easier not to, showing up when they were tired, treating me like a person with a mind worth respecting. That's how trust actually works. It's not a feeling, it's a record. If there's anything I want to leave you with, it's this. Your instincts are data. When something goes quiet inside you during a conversation that should feel warm, when your body goes still and careful in a room full of people smiling, that stillness is telling you something real. I almost talked myself out of it after Diane's Thanksgiving comment. I almost thought, "You're being paranoid, Constance. You're a 69-year-old woman sitting at her own table with her family. Stop." I'm glad I didn't stop. You don't have to have spent 3 decades in social work to trust what you know. You just have to be willing to take it seriously when your own mind raises its hand. The magnolia tree is blooming again. I can see it from the kitchen window while the coffee brews. Warren planted it the year our youngest was born, and it has never once failed to come back in spring, which is not something I take for granted anymore. Neither is the house. Neither is the morning. Neither is the particular quiet of a life that is still against everything. Mine.